Hey guys, Amoeba Ambusher again. I gotta quickly explain what in the bejesus I'm trying to do here. So I had a match where I got 2,500 spawn points in the MiG-23 MLD, so I decided to spawn the Tu-95, but spawning the nuke plane in and then dropping the nuke and then ending the match early is kinda boring and kind of a buzzkill, so I was thinking of ways to make this more interesting. And so I thought, hey, how cool would it be if I managed to fly the Tu-95 all the way back to the friendly side of the map, then intercept a B-52 and have an epic bomber dogfight? Don't question why we were trying this. We kinda got bored of just getting the nuke plane and wanted to do something silly. First time, I managed to fly back to our side, but nobody spawned in the B-52, so we just kinda screwed around with some squad mates. Incredibly silly stuff here. Some random friendlies decided to join in, and that was pretty fun and pretty wholesome. So when we got bored of waiting for the B-52s to show up, we thought, okay, what if we decided to fly the Tu-95 all the way back to the enemy airfield again and actually try to drop the nuke this time to actually end the match. And we got pretty far, but some stinky phantoms showed up and decided to ruin the fun, so that was a bit of a bummer. On the second and third time I was trying this, I was trying to RTB and then I got shot down by some very rude phantoms with no manners and no sense of whimsy in their lives, when it's obvious that I'm not going for their airfield and I'm just trying to have fun. It was very sad, since I had made it almost halfway, and it seemed like the enemies were going to spawn a B-52 eventually. It's also an unfortunate way to learn that the muzzle velocity on the Tu-95 turret guns is 690 meters per second, same as the Tu-4. So I ended up missing all of my shots. It was very tragic. Skill issue or something, but yeah, this gun is not the easiest to aim. I did try to fight back as much as I could though. The ECM blocks most radar missiles, so my main concern was heat seekers. So I had all of my engines turned off, but I guess I was still too hot. I should have popped flares, but I also realized too late that while you're in gunner view, you can't actually pop your countermeasures, so, well, that was a bummer. And, well, this is the fourth attempt, and I think this might have been the dumbest match I've had in this thing, so let's just roll the footage. Now, I remember saying in the previous video that I think that the American teams have the advantage even without the F4J and the F4S, and that I thought the F4E was better than the MiG-23. Well, I think I want to walk back that statement. No, I still think the F4J is way too strong for this bracket. Anyone who knows what they're doing will be able to stomp very easily without much effort, like I showed before. And I do still think that the MiG-23 is a bit clunky to use. It feels awkward to roll around at certain speeds and at certain wing sweep angles, and I can't really figure out why, since at certain low speeds and certain high speeds it does maneuver pretty well. And the radar is pretty annoying to use. You can't actually angle your radar downwards more than -6 degrees, and the radar only goes into MTI mode when you point the radar downwards below the horizons. You only get a tall box ACM, and it takes a while for that tall box to scan up and down. And the same MTI restriction applies to that as well. So it feels like they were trying to design a radar that is the least functional and least ergonomic MTI radar that you could possibly use. But when you do get it to work, it's pretty good. The mere threat of you having the potential to launch an R-24R without having to worry about ground clutter means that the enemy is forced to multipath, which is going to make it difficult for them to counterattack, and if they don't, then there's a good chance that they just get swatted out of the sky. You will see me quite often trying to fight against my own radar to get it to lock what I want it to, but I think I am getting the hang of it. You just sort of have to wobble your nose up and down, above and below the horizon whenever you want the radar to lock what you want it to. The maneuverability at high speeds isn't great, but it still works well enough, and I think the Gush 23 actually works quite well in the head-on, even if its muzzle velocity is so low, just because it has a lot of one-shot potential and it has a very high fire rate. So you can kind of just spray a bunch of rounds out and sometimes you can get kills with it. And it is also maneuverable enough to maneuver while flaring to get out of the way of front aspect aim 9Ls, since you can't really just rely on flaring alone. And also being one of the fastest jests on the deck at this battle rating is definitely a benefit. It makes disengaging and re-engaging really easy. You do of course have to worry about F4Js and F4Ss since their missiles are much longer range and maneuver better, and they get an HMD making it much easier for them to lock you. But as long as you're aware of the threat, you can just still multipath them, and they don't really have a good IR front aspect option, so you only really need to worry about the AIM-7Fs. And the F4E, I still think it's alright and decently capable, but the meta at this point has devolved into taking as many head-ons as quickly as possible, and the R-24Rs and R-60Ms are excellent at bonking enemies that are flying just a bit too high and aren't flaring, while the AIM-9L is just sort of okay in the head-on. While the Dogfight Sparrows are only really useful for hitting anybody who pops significantly above the ground. So for the most part, they're kinda just dead weight. I think it's also partially due to the fact that a lot of the American players aren't that prepared to flare in the head-on, probably because they're not as experienced, while the Russian players seem to do it a lot more often. So there is definitely a player skill element involved in my opinion. If the player skills were even, I think the MLD would still be better, but I don't think the discrepancy would be nearly as big as I'm experiencing right now. And another element that's making it a lot easier to play Russia than America at the moment is they recently buffed the track rate of the enemy SPAAs, which has made the Russian OSA SPAA SAM sights absolutely evil. They track via semi-automatic command to line of sight, or SACLOS, which basically means that they point the missile towards you and then the missile just tries to follow it. And while the OSAs do have a radar, you can't actually notch or multipath them because the actual guidance type is basically point and track. They fire at you starting 10 kilometers, so basically what it does is it creates a giant death bubble of radius 10 kilometers that if you go inside, then you're on borrowed time. You can't really out-energy them either because the missile burns for a really long time and is very maneuverable. And the only real way to dodge it is to exit that 10 kilometer radius bubble, or to find some ground cover to block line of sight, both of which are not really consistent or reliable methods. The Americans' counterpart, the Florakrad, is also buffed, but it's not nearly as strong, and you can actually pretty easily outpull them, especially if you're close range. I don't really know what the intention behind this was. I'm guessing maybe they saw that people were nuking airfields too much and so wanted to make SPA stronger, but I don't think this has really prevented suicide airfield runs. They still happen pretty often. All it really has done is that bomb tossing is a bit riskier since 10 kilometers is about the range where you want to start pitching up for your bomb toss. And it's made it so that you really don't want to fly onto the enemy side before engaging in a dogfight. So as the Americans, you're sort of just sat waiting for the Russians to exit their airspace, which puts them on the back foot. It's a really strange balancing decision. I thought the SPAs felt alright before. If anything, I think that they should buff the health of the airfield so that they don't get one-shot by the medium-sized nuke, or put some sort of spotting radar around them so that friendlies can tell when there's a bombing run happening. Also, I'm intentionally not talking about the gameplay right now because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I am playing in probably the most brain-dead way possible, since I have been trying to get a bomber dogfight for literal hours. And I'm not cutting any kills, I'm not cutting any in-between footage other than me just taking off. I've added a match timer in the upper right-hand corner just so that you can see how early in the match this still is. And somehow this is working out way too well. I mean, I didn't expect it to be this easy to just go for their airfield. And after the first airfield run, I was thinking, surely I won't be able to get this again. And then I got it again, and then I was thinking, okay, is it gonna happen again? And at this point, I think we're on the third or fourth airfield run. It's absolutely absurd. It hasn't even been 20 minutes yet, and I already have 20 kills. I guess this is what happens when you have no sense of self-preservation whatsoever. Which goes for both sides. I don't think the enemy team is doing that much to avoid dying either, but the vibe here is completely different from ARB. I don't think it should replace ARB, because I do sort of like the high-stakes, one-life aspect of ARB. It creates a lot of tension, especially towards the late game, and this match doesn't really have that since it's more objective-focused. And I would hate to see this game mode, but with only one life, because that would be a massive pain in the butt. And it is a lot of fun not having to worry about dying, just throwing yourself in and seeing what happens. I can't really say that I'm not enjoying myself here. But they do definitely need to nerf the SPAAs again. It makes any sort of dogfight over enemy sides completely unviable, especially for the Americans. Now I'm sort of just throwing these R60s out there, and I'm getting really surprised by the ability for them to just sort of bonk people at point blank range. I think I've launched some of these at like 0.2 kilometers and they're still hitting without blowing me up. Which is kind of absurd, and you definitely cannot do this with the AIM-9Ls. The AIM-9Ls do sort of work in the head-on. You can launch them from pretty close up, but you don't really want to do it from closer than 1 kilometer, and you have to hope that while the enemy flares, that they don't maneuver. Because if they only flare and fly in a straight line, then there is a good chance that the missile just still continues flying straight and bonks them, even if it has locked onto flares. And this is airfield run number 5. At this point, I feel like I have to have killed some of these guys on the airfield multiple times. And I do think this is somewhat of a problem with the game mode itself. If someone has no self-preservation and just goes for an airfield run, then they can achieve it. And it's very hard to catch enemies that are just straight gunning for a location if they're multipathing. This does also go for the F4Es as well, though it's a little harder since they have to continuously multipath. And they're not nearly as fast, but if you don't kill somebody in the head-on, then you're forced to turn around to try and catch them, and when you turn, you lose speed, and you're not going to be able to keep up with them as they make their suicide run. I'm not sure if I see a really good solution for this, other than trying to disincentivize suicide nuke runs by making spawning the nuke planes themselves more expensive, or making the airfields tankier so that a suicide airfield run isn't profitable enough for you to spawn in another nuke. Or, well, maybe this is Gaijin's intended game design. Maybe they do want you to just suicide into the airfields. But if it is, then I think it's bad game design. I went over this in the previous video, but I'm also not that big a fan of airfield nuking from a gameplay consequences standpoint, because while it is cool to strategize being able to nuke the enemy airfields and push the enemy back from a strategic standpoint, functionally what this just does is it makes it so that it takes a lot longer for you to actually find the enemies and kill them because their spawns are farther back now. So it makes the game a lot more boring, and it gets kind of frustrating if you spend 10 minutes looking for somebody in the late game. You find them and then you just die in a head-on, because that's just the default gameplay that happens in this event. So I think there needs to be some sort of an airfield repair mechanic, or some way for you to capture enemy airfield so that the front lines will stay consistently close to each other and keep the action up. This might be a horrible reference point since I don't really play PvP games or FPS games, but the first FPS game that I played was Hell Let Loose, and I think the system that they use in terms of pushing and pulling the front lines forwards and backwards is pretty fun, but that's because you have the ability to push the front lines forwards and then set up bases there. And flanking isn't as trivial as just wandering around on the side of the map where there is no SPAA cover, which I think is also an issue. I think there needs to be SPAA cover on the sides of the side airfields as well, so that the process of nuking them isn't just fly around the coast or fly around the mountainside and then just pop up for the nuke. It's a little too trivial that way. I also got a lot of comments about nuclear option. I've never played the game before, I don't know how it works, but apparently this game mode seems very inspired by it, and so I would imagine that nuclear option is a lot better in terms of balancing, in terms of gameplay loop. So if it is as good as other people say it is, then hopefully Gaijin takes a lot of notes from them. Because as fun as this game mode can be, I think it has a lot of potential to be a lot better. I mean, really, that goes for the entirety of War Thunder. There's so much potential, and Gaijin just sort of sits there and does nothing. They just prefer to pump out premium slop, so hopefully there's enough momentum here that they actually decide to get off their asses and do something about it. Anyways, that's enough yap. I guess I'll commentate over the gameplay now. I'm not quite able to get to the airfield as consistently anymore. It seems like the enemies are putting up more of a fight, or I'm taking more risks. As I said, my brain state has kind of deteriorated from having played this game mode too long. But the enemies also seem to be catching on to what I'm trying to do, so they are killing me a lot more often. But I'm at least still going even. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna get comments about how everybody here is a paid actor or something, and yeah, sure, I paid all of these people off. But I don't think it's great that newbies who don't really have much experience at Missile Thunder have to deal with this. I feel like they should make a separate matchmaker where only players that don't have rank 7 planes can join, because this is a little too unfair. This is supposed to be a fun April Fool's event, and while it can be pretty silly to see a bunch of nukes going off in a War Thunder match, there isn't that much inherent silliness in this game mode. And so if you're not really that big a fan of this BR ARB anyways, then I can definitely see why you would really dislike this game mode from an April Fool's perspective. Something that could have been more fun is if they just gave you the B-52 or the Tu-95 and you got to dogfight each other or tried to blow each other up with the nuclear blasts. Something that's silly and also accessible to everybody. I also made a bit of a false comparison when I was trying to compare this with the previous April Fool's event, the World War I tanks game mode. That game mode was pretty uninspired. I think they were testing like infantry mechanics or something. But I think it was at least more accessible to more people because playing a World War tank basically just involves you holding WASD and using mouse click to shoot the gun. So it's not that difficult to get used to, whereas with these jets there's a lot more going on. I'm glad they're doing this, I'm glad they're testing this, and it's a fun event, but I feel like it should have just been an event like when they were testing Seed, and made April Fool something more fun, silly, accessible, that everybody could enjoy. Now we have hit final escalation level, we hit it at minute 33-ish. I don't really want to attempt to spawn in my bomber just yet though, since a lot of people like to camp the bomber air spawns these days if they can see that somebody on the enemy team might have a bomber. So right now I want to try and convince the enemies that I'm just going to stay in the fighter, because then there's a chance that they might see that I'm not spawning in the bomber and then give up and leave. So while waiting, I was thinking what a funny idea might be is that since I have the spawn points for it, maybe I'll try and go for a bombing run on the enemy airfield with the MiG-23 MLD with the small bomb. Since I was pretty successfully able to get to their airfield multiple times, I might just be able to nuke their airfield and get a bunch of kills that way. But this was seemingly the one time that the enemies were actually able to aim, so that was unfortunate. I do have enough spawn points to spawn it in again, but I'm hoping at this point I've convinced the enemy team that I'm not spawning in the bomber, and so I'm actually going to try and spawn the Tu-95 again. I'm also looking at the enemy team. Some of the enemies who have been doing only air-to-air have almost 5,000 score, which means that they're likely to spawn a B-52 eventually. And I want to be there when that happens so that I can get the dogfight that I'm looking for. So if I want to get there in time, then I'm going to have to spawn it in now. I'm going to go south air spawn since it seems a little closer. I'm taking all flares since the primary threat is IR missiles. And the plane does come equipped with the bajillion chaff anyways. So fingers crossed that nobody's up here with me, engines off so that I don't contrail. And I'm going to try and make it as quickly as I can towards my side. In the previous attempts I was diving quite a bit, almost down to 6,000 in the hopes that higher up enemies wouldn't spot me. But I think that was actually too close to the ground because a lot of enemies were actually able to spot me from below, and I think that's how a lot of the enemy phantoms were able to catch me. So this time I'm going to try and stay as high as I can, just below 9,000 so that I can avoid contrailing. I should be able to turn my engines back on now. And now it's time for the long trek home, which doesn't actually take too long. This plane is actually quite fast. Main problem is that if you go over Mach 0.85, then your wings rip off, so if possible, avoid that. And worst case scenario, if I do get shot down, then I do have enough spawn points to spawn in another one, so hopefully they don't expect a second Tu-95 to spawn in. Especially since I don't think anybody else on my team has enough spawn points to spawn anything in. Luckily, there was no one camping the air spawn, so I have made it about halfway to my side. There does seem to be an enemy high up, but he doesn't seem to be looking for me. More concerningly is that my RWR is going off. And it's a pretty terrible RWR. It doesn't actually pick up the Patriots or any of the ground missiles that get fired at you, which means that there's definitely some sort of an enemy plane that's trying to tell me right now. I don't know how much this is going to help, but I'm going to request some cover from my teammates. I don't know how on board these guys are going to be in trying to help me achieve my goals, because some players are unreasonably invested in trying to win the match, and they might see this as me actively throwing the match. I don't really see any friendlies around either, but oh god, here comes the Phantom. It is an F4S, so there is a chance that he's running an All Sparrows loadout, which would be to my benefit. But I can't rule out the possibility that he has AIM-9Hs, which are going to have a pretty long range at this high altitude, so it's not nearly as scary as the AIM-9Ls, since the 9Ls are a lot more flare resistant, but I will have to turn my engines off here in a bit to try and avoid him shooting any IR missiles at me at all. Since even if I do flare, it seems that this plane is not really good at avoiding IR missiles. The plane is just too big that no matter how many flares you drop, the missile is just going to reacquire you. I'm just going to turn my engines off now. Hopefully they'll cool off fast enough that he won't be able to launch on me. I do want as much speed as possible to minimize the closure rate for when I try to gun him down, but I also can't dive that much because my speed is capped at Mach 0.85. I am kind of begging in the chat that this guy doesn't try and shoot me down, but every single time I've tried this, it just seems to make the enemy Americans much more invested in trying to kill me. Incredibly unfortunate. I don't really have a means to dodge either. I can't hit the countermeasures button, so I'm just gonna hit the periodic flares button. But to my surprise, I didn't notice one of my friendlies had actually come by and shot an R-24R. My savior! Thank you so much. I've died so many times in this same situation that I had almost given up hope, but it seems my friendlies came in clutch. Oh, that feels so good. Well, let's kick those engines back up because it looks like an enemy is going to spawn in a B-52 pretty soon. And I'm much too far away at the moment. I need to get there fast. This plane does climb very well though, so getting back up to altitude shouldn't be too much of an issue. I think they spawn at 10,000 meters. But I still do have half the map to cover, so while I'm at much lower of a risk of dying to an enemy, I'm still going to be fighting against the clock. And yeah, the enemy has spawned in a B-52. I'm not going to be able to get there in time before he nukes the airfield, so my best bet is to maybe just try and convince him in the chat. It does look like either way though, he's getting engaged by a friendly MiG-23. Kind of not the ideal outcome, but at least it extends the match long enough for me to get to there, and maybe another guy is going to spawn in. He hasn't been shut down yet, so I don't know if the MiG-23 has actually got him down. He might be struggling if he hasn't brought the R-24Ts. I'm trying to employ my persuasive skills in the chat right now, but unfortunately I don't think the B-52 is in a position to negotiate. I am also realizing that he's the same guy that tried to shoot me down in that 4S, so he might be a little bit of a stinky player who is anti-fun. And yeah, he gets gunned down by the MLD, and I don't think he was in any sort of a trajectory to nuke the airfield, so it looks like the match is going to go on for now. There is a possibility that another enemy B-52 shows up, and then maybe I can get a fight out of it. Mr MJ217 says in the chat that he's only 150 spawn points away. Come on, that's like 1 or 2 kills. Surely he can get it. I am now in position, so whenever he's ready, he should be able to spawn. I am constantly also trying to check the leaderboard so that I can see when he's going to spawn in. If you don't spend any spawn points spawning in nukes, then you can get the 2,500 spawn point nuke when you have about 5,000 mission scores, so he is really close. So surely in the next few minutes he should be able to get it. But after waiting for 6 whole minutes and absolutely nobody showing up, the only difference is that guy has died 3 more times and hasn't actually gotten anything done. He's so close. This is also why I really don't like the late game in this event game mode. I already went over this, but because the forward airfields are all gone, it just makes it so that it takes 10 more years to actually find anybody and get a fight out of them. especially for the Americans since they can't really contest the OSAs, and so are kind of barred from flying over our airspace. At this point, I'm just kind of tweaking out, and the match ends prematurely because our team ends up nuking a bunch of their stuff, so they run out of tickets, and I'm like, oh man. If I knew this was going to be the case, I would have at least tried to nuke our airfield for the funsies. But there's no time left for that anymore, the match is over, which kind of sucks. And I think I'm gonna give up on trying to do this dumb thing with the bomber dogfight because it's not working out. Also, why did the escalation level go down? Why is it on level 2 now? That is very strange. This game mode does seem very buggy. The final mission report screen doesn't show up very often. The replays are completely bugged and die after the first 15 minutes and don't have any bookmarks that show. And probably because there's so many missiles, the missile diamonds don't show the correct range half the time. Oh well, hopefully those are things that Gaijin can also fix. But that's everything for today. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.
Toad bread, toady toad bread. This toad-shaped bread with golden crust croaks from the oven with a smell so robust. He dances with rosemary and garlic too. This toad bread is perfect to mop up your stew. But surely you can make it too, for the recipe is found in my cookbook of Nuke.